I'd like to welcome you to the second part of the first lecture of our academic course. In this part of the lecture, you'll find out how to organize the last major parts of research paper, the results and the discussion sections. Let's start with a brief review of the results section. This is the third major section of most scientific papers. It follows the presentation of the methods and comes before the discussion section. The results section answers the question, what did you find in your research? All you need to do in this section is to report the findings of your study. In this part of research paper, you should not discuss what these findings mean. That debate takes place in the discussion section. Now, we move on to the next part of the lecture, where we are going to focus on the discussion section. In this section, you need to summarize your results and relate them to the theoretical ideas outlined in the introduction. Next, you discuss the practical implications of your study, identify its limitations, and comment on the validity of your conclusions. Finally, you discuss directions for future research. Now, let's talk about the discussion section in greater detail. You have to begin it with a brief summary of the results of your investigation. You are not recommended to use a lot of numbers here. Your results should be explained in words rather than in numbers. Here you can see the sentence from the mnemonic study we discussed earlier. These two sentences summarize the results of the study and state that participants using the mnemonic recall significantly more of the easily imaged words than those not using the mnemonic. However, the group recalled similar numbers of the hard-to-image words. The next thing you should do is to answer the question, how well do your results fit the predictions? Do your results support the experimental hypothesis or not? The sentence you can see here states that these results support the experimental hypothesis. Thus, as predicted, the mnemonic specifically enhanced the recall of the more easily imaged words. This is how we describe our results in the discussion section. So, the first task in the discussion section is to summarize the results of the study. Once you've done this, you need to explain these findings and answer the questions. Is the independent variable responsible for changes in the dependent variable? If not, what other variables cause the changes? So, the second task in the discussion section is to explore the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. For example, in our mnemonic experiment, we have found the link between the independent variable, which is the imageability of the words, and the dependent variable, which is the number of words recalled. The sentence you can see here suggests that the link between the dependent variable and the dependent variable exists. There is some suggestion in the data that the participants recalled easily imaged words more readily than hard-to-imagine ones. However, we can't be sure what exactly caused an increase in the number of words recalled. Was it the independent variable, or were there unique and founding variables that could also account for this effect? Here you can see the sentence from the mnemonic paper. There may be other ways in which the list of words differed above their imageability, and this could account for any differences in recall. So, what are these factors that could account for the differences in recall? For example, this might be the difference in the length of words in list 1 and list 2. And if these differences in the length of words really matter, you need to re-examine the experiment and, if necessary, modify the design of your experiment by matching your list of words for length. Only when you have satisfied yourself that there are no confounding variables, you can draw firm conclusions about the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. The next thing you need to do is to return to the literature review in your introduction and re-examine the previous studies in the light of your findings. You have to answer the question, are your findings consistent with the theoretical ideas discussed in the introduction? For example, in the mnemonic study, the researchers relate their findings to the previous study carried out by Clark in 1971. This study was previously examined in the introduction. In 1971, Clark found that the mnemonic technique enhanced recall of words. Moreover, participants in Clark's study recalled significantly more words high in imageability than words low in imageability. The researchers comment on the similarities between the results of the study and their own findings and say the findings of this study are consistent with those of Clark. The next questions you have to answer are as follows. What insight on this phenomenon does your study provide? What have you learned about the independent variable from the experiment? For example, in the mnemonic study, the researchers replicated the earlier experiment, but they contributed to the knowledge in the area by manipulating a previously used variable in a different manner. Namely, they allowed the participants to practice the method of loci prior to the start of the experiment. Once you've interpreted your results in relation to the theories discussed in the introduction, you need to ask yourself, are there any implications of the study for real-life problems? Here, you can see a sentence which comments on the practical implications of the mnemonic study. The practical implications of the current findings are clear. If the participants have had sufficient practice in the use of the mnemonic, the method of loci leads to improvement in their memory performance. Since research is seldom perfect, you need to identify the weaknesses in your method. Answer the questions. What are the limitations of the study? Is it possible that the outcome of an experiment could be attributed to some factor other than the independent variable? For example, in the mnemonic study, the researchers consider the possibility that easily imaged words may be easier to recall even without the use of mnemonic. They acknowledge that there might be an alternative explanation of their results, such as this data raise the possibility that easily imaged words may be easier to recall even without the use of mnemonic, perhaps because they typically denote more familiar concrete objects. Once you've identified the limitations of your research, you should answer the questions. For each limitation I identified earlier, how could I redesign my study to improve it? What other kinds of studies could I carry out to investigate the issue further? As we said earlier, the researchers could offer at least two explanations of the fact that easily imaged words were easier to recall. The first explanation was the use of the mnemonic device. An alternative explanation was that easily imaged words were easier to recall because they typically denote more familiar concrete objects. Discussing directions for future research, the authors of the paper say that it would be theoretically interesting to test whether people recall easily imaged words more easily and investigate reasons for the differences if it's shown to exist. Now, we are going to talk about the conclusion paragraph in the discussion section. You need to end the discussion section with a commentary on the importance of your findings. What might a strong ending look like? It should summarize your main conclusions, but you need to be careful to distinguish between conclusions and mere restatements of findings. In the mnemonic study, researchers can say it's certainly necessary to invest further research in the effectiveness of the method of loci, but the results of this study indicate a relevant potential lying in the use of this mnemonic technique. If your discussion section has been a long one, such a summary of your message can be helpful. Also, you can add the conclusion section for this purpose. A good conclusion acts like a solid full stop to the report. It's important to understand that in the conclusion, you must summarize your discussion, not simply refer to it. For example, it's not enough to write such phrases as "the evidence presented shows," "the studies discussed suggest." You can't expect the reader to remember your entire discussion. You must show how the evidence leads to your conclusion. That's why your conclusion should include such comments as, although Clark proposed that the findings of Kent and Lane are inconsistent with this, These phrases will help your reader understand how you discuss the research problem in your paper. Here you can see the sentences from the mnemonic study, which not only presents the results of the study, but also summarize the main points discussed in the paper. In conclusion, the findings suggest that the method of loci does make a difference to recall. It does so by enhancing the recall of easily imaged words. Ensures failure to find an improvement in recall among those using the mnemonic appears to have resulted from not giving the participants enough time to practice. The conclusion is the last paragraph or section in your research paper. Although you summarize the content of the research paper here, this does not, of course, mean that you should duplicate the abstract. Here you must summarize the key points from the introduction and the discussion. That completes our lecture. Thank you for your attention.